No, thank you. Thank you. So hello. I think I probably need to warn you, brace yourselves. This is slightly different to the previous two talks. Had the opportunity to arrive a little bit early, walked around the old town. It's a bit smaller than I remember. And there's things missing. The Beehive sweet shop. Where is that? I didn't get to go down to the main high street, which had Gamley's on it. I assume that Gamley's doesn't exist anymore. Okay. But we did have a real bonus, actually. We walked. We were told that the guys who own Chantry Cottage weren't around today. So I'm poking around their front garden thinking, well, they're not here, it's okay. The door opens. So, oh, hello. Anyways, he was beautifully tidy anyway, but he let us in, which was fantastic. So we got the opportunity to look around, certainly the ground floor of Chantry Cottage. And the biggest thing was, I was very small when I lived here. I will get onto the talk in a minute. And yet, some of the rooms were really large and some of the rooms were tiny. And things like the main stairs that came down, that we used to stand at the top, put cushions at the bottom, and then hurl ourselves down and see whether we could do that without killing ourselves. And now we're only about 10 stairs high and about this high. Anyways, so here we are. So a couple of other things. I'm not a trained professional public speaker, as you can probably tell already. No. I've decided that Donald Trump is President of the United States. So I'm going to give it a good go, because he clearly is, I hope to be more successful, perhaps. The other thing about the talk, I think, is I'm really going to cover a period. I came to Bexhill in 1974-ish. My father came here in about 1973. So it's been a while. I love this picture, actually. This is actually Chantry Cottage in the background. For years and years and years, I thought it was Manor Gardens. I looked more closely, and it is actually me in front of Chantry Cottage. In 1974, my father very helpfully signed the back of the do you remember photographs? Photographs. A. Sanders, 1974. I thought, God, 1974, that sounds quite modern from where we started the evening in 700 and so. And we went back to 18 and 19 and 1920s, 30s and so on. I thought, okay, well, I'm really going to start talking about 1972, 1974. And then I saw this thing on Instagram the other day, and it was quite sobering, actually. It said that the distance that 2026 and 1974 are as far apart as 1974 and 1920. So I'm thinking we're going to talk about something quite modern and contemporary, perhaps, from where we've been with the last couple of talks. But it's still a long time ago. It's still 50 years ago. But some of the things that you'll see tonight, brace yourselves, are in colour. We've looked for pictures with people in clothes, hopefully, mostly. But I really want to tell you about an interesting resident from Bexhill. I've already deviated entirely from my talk. So really, Bexhill and the old towns had some rather interesting inhabitants, as we've learned. We were opposite neighbours. I think that we probably met at some point. And including my father, Alex Sanders, resident of Chantry Cottage for about 10 years or so. And I think probably the first thing, which I've already said, is that I'm not a witch. It's a small but important clarification. My father was King of the Witches, and my mother was the Queen of the Witches. Actually, she is still the Queen of the Witches, not quite retired. But she was a witch queen. There are some definitions when you come to witchiness. You can be Queen of the Witches forever, but a witch queen, actually quite topically, tends to be almost like a May Queen. It happens around the 1st of May. You tend to be 18, very, very young and beautiful. And I'm none of the above. I'm not even a princess, sadly. And this could come as a relief to some of you, or quite a disappointment, depending on what you're hoping for this evening. But what is true that I was raised by witches. First in Notting Hill Gate, and a bit like you were saying about Chelsea, was maybe more salubrious. Is that the right way? Chelsea wasn't necessarily as posh and gorgeous as it is now, and Notting Hill was somewhere slightly different in the 70s for sure. So born and raised in Notting Hill, then I came to the old town, and then went back full circle, excuse the pun, to London again in my early teens. So Alex, King of the Witches, alongside my mother, the Witch Queen, certainly a power couple on every level. I have one small aside, I think, when I'm talking about my parents and I'm saying Alex and Maxine. That's not me talking about Alex and Maxine because that helps you rather than me saying mum and dad all the time. I've never called them mum and dad. They've always told me that that's their names, that's what I should call them. So their names are precious to them and therefore precious to me. So when I'm talking about Alex and Maxine, yes, I'm talking about my mum and dad, but they are who I know. Of course, with weird and wonderful parents, lots of people's instinct, and certainly mine was to head firmly in the opposite direction and really think Sappy from Ab Fab, if you've ever seen that. That's kind of me. Growing up, oh, God, witches. So yes, that was me. So what have I been doing in all these years? A very sensible career in marketing, a normal life in London, very solid, all the things that you do differently. No rituals, no robes. But here we are. So when did this all start? Well, back in the 60s, and I'm actually conscious even tonight that I've seen people here tonight where we've got 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, people who've known my family. So back in the 60s, very much swinging London, a city alive with change, all the things that you'd expect from swinging London, rebellion, music, colour, very alternative, and there's certainly the sense that the old rules no longer applied. People at that time, they probably still are to be honest with you, were looking for something different and something much deeper. And into that space stepped my parents, Alex and Maxine, offering not just spectacle, but meaning. They did pretty well with spectacle actually, to be honest with you, and you'll see this. For over a decade, they found themselves on the front pages and in front of the camera. My father certainly courted the attention and played to the crowd, and for quite a while, they were the most famous white witches in Britain. The news of the world at its best and at its worst was when my parents were big. They carried on in that vein throughout the 70s. I'll get to the whole Bexhill story, but this is the background, this is your context. They starred in a film called Legend of the Witches. And I'm very proud, actually. I've got the physical, the actual invitation. And it premiered on my second birthday. I'm not quite sure where I was. However, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily the truth for that evening, but my mother does tell me that Stripper Lil, who was an associate of the craze, was quite a regular babysitter for me. So maybe. Actually, she told me a little bit more about that, and yeah. There were collaborations as well with bands like Black Widow, and consultations on films. Again, the 70s, you can remember the 70s, it was Hammer House of Horror, there were loads, they were churning out films, including a film, a Roman Polanski film, and this was a consultation rather than starring in this film. And the film was The Eye of the Devil, where my parents taught Sharon Tate how to most effectively cast a circle. So, and there was a magazine Partwork series. Again, remember magazines, remember Partwork series when you used to get one every single week, typically with a free gift stuck to the front of it. I think I don't know what I collected, whatever the precursor to My Little Pony was. But there was a magazine Partwork in the 70s called Man, Myth and Magic, and my father made the front page of that. Looking quite sinister, I have to say. They didn't use skulls and crossbones and things like this. These were props. So when I say he courted attention, he really did court attention. But I think the title here is interesting. I know for some of you who knew him or you may know of him, is this question, this title, Man, Myth and Magic, is actually really quite neat, because it's one of the questions that never really leaves him to people who follow his tradition or sort of look into witchcraft in any shape or form. And the type of person he was that's the question that really never quite leaves him, man, myth, or something else. So by the early 60s, so I came along, mid-60s or so, I'll tell you in a minute, they created what became known as the Alexandrian tradition. So my father had been busy up. He was born in 1926, so he had a whole life and career and a marriage, and was a professional spiritualist and various other things along the way. get to the early 60s, and they created a branch of religion, of witchcraft, called the Alexandrian tradition. And Sharon is here to explain that properly, because as you can tell already that I wouldn't do it justice. Because I've lived with it for so long, and from the inside out, that I really wouldn't do it justice. I think Sappy from Ab Fab again. And then in the late 60s, mid-60s, okay, 1967, I arrived. This is quite a new picture for me. I've only seen this in the last year or so. I thought when you're this old, you don't see that many pictures of yourself as a baby. I've got a lot of hair. And my mother said, oh, God, the nurses called you Lou Brush. Thanks. Great. Lots of stories about my birth, written in various books. So they're certainly written in the, I don't think it was The King of the Witches, I think it was Maxine Witch Queen, and 2 or 3 other, and it's also been covered in a few articles in the News of the World, and I think, unfortunately, in the magazine called Tits and Bits, because that was the 70s, where she's being interviewed for, they're both being interviewed about their beliefs and their, and tell us about the most sensationalist parts of magic and witchcraft. So this has been documented. This isn't just me imagining this. So lots and lots of stories about my birth. I was conceived inside a circle. There was an intention. They absolutely decided they wanted a child. They wanted a child. They wanted a moon child. So that meant for 9 months, my mother ate pale beige food, pale food, and wore pale clothes, and wore, pale clothes, light robes and cords and so on. And eventually I was born. There was a ritual, and I was ultimately born. So I'm technically a moon child, which is really lovely. I was not the boy child that they were looking for. I was not Michael, which they were a bit disappointed about, to be honest with you. And when my mum was in hospital, one of the witches, a Greek witch, Spiros, came in the next day, and he looked down and he said, oh God, don't worry, it won't live. So, thanks. Anyway, I'm quite hard to get rid of, so as you can see, I'm still here. So my name's Maia. I'm named after the mother goddess, and Maia also means magic in Sanskrit. And Maia has been in and out of fashion at the moment. There's loads and loads of kids called Maia. Mine is actually spelled M-A-Y-A, but everyone called me Maia, so I changed it to an I, and now all the little girls are called Maia, M-A-Y-A. So I may have to change it back, maybe. So, oh goodness me, see, I've got balance problems. The early 70s brought change, and my parents separated. So it was in the early 70s that my father moved here to Chantry Cottage. It's about 73, 74. And what was interesting was he moved here to live with his much younger lover, John. So when my father married my mother, he was 40, and his wife, my mother, Maxine, was 20. And then he moved here with his younger lover, John, who was about 21. So moved to Chantry Cottage, and Betty Britton, whose house it was, we all lived in this little house. So my brother, so I was 6 or 7, and my brother was 2, going on 3. And it was very much Maia lives with Alex and John, bringing them tea on a tray in the morning. And I suppose I can say that quite flippantly now. It's 2026. Of course, people live with all sorts of variations on families and everything else. But I think it's quite easy to underestimate what that meant at the time. This is 1972, 1973. And it was only a few years, 5, 6 years, since decriminalisation. So in its own way, it's as unconventional as everything else. So before I take you to Chantry Cottage, I'm going to hand over to Sharon, because at this point, you're probably wondering what this witchcraft thing is all about. So she's going to give you the explainer.
Great. I didn't know Alex. Never met him. He passed away today, 38 years ago. And I was initiated much later in 2013. So what I can do is give you some background as to how Alexandria witchcraft came about through the inspirations of Alex and Maxine Sanders, and also give you some insight into what this looks like in everyday life. Maia referred to the 1960s, time of flower power, rebellion, exploration. It was also a time of alternative spiritual paths emerging. So this was a perfect time, a perfect setting for Alex and Maxine to be coming up with what they did. How they went about it is that they drew from existing esoteric streams. And so for structure, they adopted a witchcraft circle. And the idea of casting a circle to create a protective space in which to do your magical work. And one of the best examples, I think, is John William Waterhouse's famed work, The Magic Circle. They also drew from ceremonial magic. So think the kind of ritual you might associate with secret societies, esoteric orders, lodge-based orders. But I think one of the most frequently understood is Freemasonry. And there were others. There are other examples that they also drew on, but Freemasonry, you get the idea. They also drew from symbolic systems. Think folk magic, including simple acts of protection, healing, blessing, working with herbs, making charms, amulets, everyday practices grounded in intention. And then they infused all of this with the worship of a god and a goddess, representing the complementary forces within nature and life. And then they shaped it deliberately, taking these strands and forming them into something structured, something that could be taught, it could be experienced and passed on. Okay, so from outside it can look quite theatrical, and something to bear in mind is that a lot of the publicized photos or the press imagery was staged. And ritual in and of itself, from an outside observation, can look quite boring. So Alex and Maxine tried to come up with imagery that would appeal, that it would have something to show that there was something going on here. And so they achieved it through that. But always keep in mind that a lot of what you see is made for stage, basically. Okay, so there are candles, there's incense, there are weapons, robes, sometimes, at other times, not. And for indoor workings, another thing that Alex and Maxine introduced was recorded music. So you might have the thundering, dramatic sound of Carmina Burana o Fortuna in the background to all of this, and which, if you've ever heard the piece, it's not subtle. But none of this is the point. It's actually closer to things you already know. Religious ritual, meditation, focused attention. The purpose is not spectacle, it's focus. It's not vague, it's not improvised. It is structured, it's documented, and it's refined over time. And it's passed on via an initiatory process that's worked into the structure of what they made. But who was it shaped for? Why were people drawn to it? And who were and are these witches? You might be surprised. Teachers, nurses, artists, doctors, lawyers, performers, your next door neighbor, the person sitting in front of you, beside you, behind you. Ordinary people drawn to something that offered meaning and purpose. In 1960s Britain, there were very real consequences for being publicly associated with witchcraft. A classic example is circa 1965, Maxine lost her job, her home, and she was attacked in the streets with stones. In a previous talk I gave on this, I made the mistake of saying she was stoned in the streets, and she pointed out that that wasn't exactly the case. That she was not stoned. Yes, she was stoned. When her photograph made headline tabloid news, was actually what catapulted her into the public purview. And she was in goddess position. She didn't know the photograph was being taken. That was naughty Alex that allowed the tabloid to do that. And she was in goddess position on the altar and under the edge, and she did not have many rope. She was naked. And so that's what it resulted in. And yet people still came. In many ways, the doorway was Alex himself. He was flamboyant, he was provocative, he was impossible to ignore, as you may have gathered. He was a magnet for the press, and crucially, he was largely impervious to the criticism that was being thrown his way. His and Maxine's, it affected Maxine more than him, actually. So people came from all over the world. Out of curiosity, searching, or simply a sense that nothing else quite fit. And in what was, on the surface, a very ordinary setting, domestic setting, a basement flat in Clonricard Gardens, Notting Hill, London, a really sketchy area at the time, not like it is today. They found something that gave that feeling shape. So you don't have to understand, or you don't have to believe in witchcraft to understand why it mattered. It offered people structure, identity, and life purpose. And in that moment in time, that was enough. So fast forward to me, an initiated priestess. What does that actually look like? The reality is, it's often very ordinary, except when it's known. People call me, message me, email me, usually not because things are going well. They have big problems, real problems. Sometimes it's practical, it's relationships, work, decision-making. Sometimes it's much deeper. I had recently some distress about a sequence of business issues. And as we talked, it became clear that this wasn't really about business. It rarely is the surface issue that has come. It was about the underlying relationship. And because we share a language and a way of working, we were able to take that set of issues and approach the situation differently. At other times, it's about healing or easing the pain, supporting someone through a terminal illness, helping families when someone's nearing the end of life. Often the work is not about stopping the process or curing the situation, the dying process. It's about easing it and bringing about acceptance and helping people, both sides, the dying and the bereaved, to let go. And that can be just as important. Whether I am working in a group, in a coven setting, the practice doesn't switch off. It informs how I think, how I respond, how I focus intention on every aspect of my life. My role very often is quite simple. Calm people down, help them see clearly, and to work with them to find a way forward. And sometimes that involves ritual, sometimes it doesn't. So when people ask, does it work? My answer is this. It works in the same way that any disciplined, focused system works. Alexandrian witchcraft gives people structure, a way of understanding their situation, and a way of acting within it. And perhaps more importantly, it gives them a sense that they are not powerless. And for many people, that's enough. Thank you.
So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of the Alexandrian tradition. I think we've heard community, support, structure, identity, purpose, the appeal, the age-old appeal of religion. So, let me tell you a bit about Alex, because I suppose that's what we're here with. We're talking about one of the residents of Bexhill Old Town, after all. Not just giving you a bit of an explainer on witches, generally. So Alex, and being at the centre of all of that here with him, and I keep resisting, and you'll see all these grand pictures of ritual and everything else going on. That's my dad on the left. I keep resisting these, I live with all these pictures on the right, but that's my dad there. So, I resist the titles, the photographs, the mythology. It's all too much, quite frankly, and equally not enough. Some of you I know here knew him, and as I say, we've got 60s. My godfather, don't ask, from the 60s right through to the 2013s. So some of you here knew him. Some may have seen his picture in the museum. You certainly had a bit of a preview. Thank you, Julie. A couple of pictures we need. Thank you. We haven't got those. And some of you may only know that it was apparently a witch who lived nearby, or some of you simply know the Chantry Cottage, which is a lovely cottage on the corner there, and you've heard something about it. So you're learning something new today. Some of you may only be here for the free buffet. The sandwiches were pretty good. I can only really offer a partial account. I say I was 6. My brother was 2 when we arrived, and I'm not entirely sure of the arrangements here. But every weekend we would walk down from Chantry Cottage to Bexhill Station on a Friday night with a wheelie bag of washing. Be put on the train to Victoria. This is me and my little brother. Put on the train to Victoria. Do you remember the old trains where you had little carriages and the guard? I don't know whether we had labels around our necks, but somehow we were put on the train. Get to Victoria, and then my mother or one of her witches would come and pick us up, get a black cab or maybe the 52 bus, and take us back to my mum's place. And that's the Temple of the Mother, and that's a capital T, capital M, the Temple of the Mother, rather than my mum's temple, in Notting Hill. And then we'd reverse everything, so Saturday night there'd be rituals and everything else. Sunday, I'm not quite sure what we did. And then Sunday evening we'd go back and do the reverse. We'd get to Victoria Station, get put on the train, handed over to a guard. 2 hours later we'd pitch up here, and presumably, hopefully somebody picked us up and brought us back here, not sure, to go to straight to school at Chantry Primary on Monday morning. So we lived between 2 parents and 2 temples. So Sharon has described Alex as, what was your list? Flamboyant, provocative, and impossible to ignore. And yes. And flamboyant is a word. I've done a bit of revising and reading up or my dad for this evening. My dad, I don't call him my dad, my father. And that word flamboyant does seem to appear over and over. So we talked about him courting publicity, but actually as a character, he was flamboyant in his own right. And it's written in pretty much everything that I've read, so it must be broadly correct. But I do think it misses something. And from my perspective as a child, and sort of sitting there, or mostly running feral, to be honest with you, was watching him and the art of control, or the art of fascination. And when I was sort of talking through this talk with my husband the other day, I'm sort of stumbling over this a little bit, trying to describe my father and whether how flamboyant he was or not. And he said, no, what the word you're looking for is charisma. I said, it wasn't charisma necessarily. And then chatting to Len just before we stood up, he said, actually, it was magnetism. And I think that's exactly right. It was magnetism and the art of fascination. So he could really hold a room. Not loudly, not necessarily theatrically, unless he wanted to turn it on, but something much more precise. And I remember being little and watching people lean in. So you'd have people would gather around him, and then you'd get some people sort of with their arms crossed. Yeah, okay, tell me what's about. And I could watch them just relax, and sometimes they went away a little bit changed. So, but I was an observer to this, and to that point, I think, and this is a bit of a witchy insider thing, but some people call him a magician rather than a witch. Now, that's not always a compliment in witchy circles, actually. But I think what they mean, or what they meant, was that he could read people and see where their attention was, and how to move that attention. He was also very funny. He was from Birkenhead originally, certainly a Lancashireman, and his humour arrived sideways, I think. You were never quite sure what he was going to say, and kind of, oh, that's quite funny. And more recently, I think Bob Mortimer probably reminds me a little of him in terms of that humour, a little bit sideways humour. So while all of this was happening, all of this quite often in the Bell, in the Delaware, my brother and I were simply children growing up around this. So very much, and I did a bit of a grand tour with Sharon this afternoon, doing roly-polies on the grass in front of the Delaware Pavilion, while Alex was upstairs inside with people always gathered around him. And we were going to school, living in one sense a really, as completely ordinary a life as you can, sort of going between two temples, but going to school Monday to Friday, and in another, not at all. So before I take you inside the cottage, I think before I take you inside, it's worth saying something about the cottage itself. Now, of course, if you probably walk past this, you're probably all relatively local. Beautiful Grade 2 listed building, light, restored, really elegant, very different to how it was in the 70s, where my memories take me to, and I know you were saying about sort of the southwest facing and being on top of the hill and the wind and everything else. I just remember it being really cold and damp, and huddled around the 3-bar electric fire and flannelette sheets. I don't know whether this is everyone's memory of the 70s, but that was mostly my memory of the 70s. And we had the opportunity to have a very quick sneak peek of the house, and it's stunning. And what is now, and it's actually really funny, because before I went round today, I'd written what is a bright and airy room at the back of the house was my father's temple. It's not actually a bright and airy room. It's a snug. It's a really nice, eclectic, modern. He's going to hate me. Man cave. It's not a man cave. It's just a beautiful room. Was at the time my father's temple, and everything your imagination could conjure up, and more. So, strangely enough, we don't have many pictures of the temple. One doesn't often, and very surprised to find these two actually. So everything you'd imagine, dimly lit, never saw the light of day, heavy velvet curtains, incense burners, cobra candlesticks. I think in London where there was a pontoon night and we did my parents did some fundraising to buy these candlesticks. There were statues bought from the nuns on Portobello Road, and an open hearth with talismans and all sorts of things around the outside. And this room, this temple, in my mind, I was this big, was large. I mean, it held 10, 15 witches who would dance around furiously naked often. I didn't always see this. I didn't see this very much. Okay. It's tiny. It's a really small room. It's about this big. But somehow it managed to house 10 or 15 witches quite often. So circles were certainly held in there. Quite often they're also held in the back garden. And I have read that the neighbours occasionally made comment. I don't know whether your father ever mentioned anything. But witches often sky-clad naturally. We had Carmina Burana blasting out, but equally we sometimes have ABBA, because it was the 80s. And the way ritual works is the witches do their thing, and then you have cakes and wine afterwards. So that was when we children were allowed to come down and have some cake, which was quite nice. That was very much once the magic had finished. So people came from all over, certainly in the early years of Bexhill. So the London temple was everything, where everything started and happened. And then my father moved, and then the first few years, people would migrate and come between the two temples for the weekend. And from further afield as well, people would come from all over the world. We've still got Murray in New Zealand, people from Australia, Brazil, India, France, everywhere. So they came from all over, and they came at all hours. Some stayed for days, some stayed just for an evening, some stayed for quite a long time, just saying. Many spent time in the bell, well, pretty much every night spent time in the bell, drinking brandy. My father's drink of choice was sweet white wine, or working their way through Embassy No. 1, 20 Park Drive, or Benson and Hedges. It was the 70s for sure. And if that wasn't enough in this temple, so I'm living with all these people. So I'm living with Alex and John. I'm living with Betty, whose house it is. We have all these people turning up, all the hours that you like. And then in addition to that, I mentioned that before my father created the Alexandrian tradition, he was a professional spiritualist for a period and was a medium. So we also had spirits come to live with us quite often. So my father would go into a trance quite often. So Spirit Michael and Red Feather were two who would turn up on occasion. And they made regular appearances. So Spirit Michael, Sharon, Spirit Michael had a particular fondness for Cadbury's Crunchies. Don't ask me why. People would bring offerings. Sometimes people would bring a basket of fruit and put it on the step outside for the King of the Witches. And then witches who knew would bring Cadbury's Crunchies, and they would go on the altar. Spirit Michael would do his thing. I don't know what that thing was, but he would do his thing, and then we were allowed to have the Crunchies a couple of days later. And the inside, the honeycomb in the Crunchie was always solidified. I assume it was magic or the incense. I'm not sure. However, so yes, that is, there's always an upside to these things. So we accepted all of this, as you do. So alongside magic circles, naked witches, alternative visitors who stayed and sometimes stayed. And here's a couple more pictures. My father looking quite sinister again. And this one is not technically a magic circle. If you look closely, you can see there's a cameraman underneath the cords. So this was obviously for some film in the 70s. So while all of this was happening, and there's more, this is actually the temple. It still looks quite large there. There's Betty. And again, they're all wearing clothes, which is good. While all of this was happening, I was in the brownies. Now, I need to be completely honest. This is not me in my brownie uniform. This is the absolute brownie uniform that we wore at the time. And this is the absolute outfit that my father wore quite often as well. So we have badges and uniforms on one side and something much less easy to define on the other. And I mentioned mornings, and mornings actually required a certain amount of navigation, actually, whichever temple I woke up in, because temples don't always reset overnight. So it's entirely possible to come home, or to come down in the morning on a school day, to come down, collect my things, and then find myself stepping over witches to get to the front door to go to school. And actually, a friend of mine told me the other day, if you ever write a book, call it Stepping Over Witches. So, in addition to this, pocket money. So I don't know where you got your pocket money from. maybe jars, maybe where you get 10p put in for being good, and then it all adds up and you get it taken out. Well, pocket money didn't really arrive in the most traditional fashion in my house in Chantry Cottage. Actually, in either London or Bexhill. So in every temple, there is a cauldron, and this is actually, didn't have a picture of my dad's cauldron. So this is Maxine's cauldron. Possibly, well, I assume everyone has a cauldron, maybe. And people, the purpose, I'm sure the cauldron has many, many purposes, apart from giving me pocket money. But people would maybe come and they put a contribution in there, there'd be a £5 note or something maybe for healing or whatever it was. So there was always money going in and out of the cauldron. And the money going out of the cauldron was my pocket money. And I would go next door to the beehive and get the sherbet lemons and also sugar mice. And I can't believe, actually, the beehive is literally next door to my house. I always thought it was at least 3 doors down. I must have eaten a lot of flapjacks, is all I can say. So yeah, coins in the cauldron made some kind of sense to me. There were also moments of complete normality. Very much a 70s photo, very, very much. Shows how little we were, actually. Again, quite a modern setup. Alex and John having charge of these 2 reprobates for 5 days a week. So very much going down to the seafront. There was a cafe, there's probably still a cafe down there where we drink Cresta. It's Frothy Man, 70s drink. Going to Gamley's, which was the height of luxury. We didn't have a lot of money, so all our clothes were from the charity shops, and I see we've still got lots and lots of charity shops in Bexhill. So really, all ordinary pleasures, sitting alongside something which was often much harder to define. And it usually worked. But sometimes it didn't. So we've sort of seen the rosy version. So I keep harking back to these witches, stepping over witches, people coming, going, staying for a day, staying for an evening, going to the bell, whatever. And they were, all sorts of people. As Sharon said, you've got teachers, nurses, whatever. Actually, my mother said to me the other day, I said, have you got any famous people? She said, oh, yeah, there's that young man, Mark Boland. Yes, he used to come. And he used to wear some sort of weird blue satin pyjamas and sit outside and copy the Book of Shadows. OK, he'll do. And Terry Pratchett as well, just to throw him in. So we had lots and lots of visitors. And they weren't all, well, very few of them were mainstream, to be honest with you. So as you'd imagine, with 2 young kids in the house, there were some rules around perhaps who we might let in and who was okay and who was not okay, particularly if you're at home by yourself while your parents are in the pub. And I do remember once I let someone in I wasn't supposed to. And I remember when he came to the door, and I must have been 9 or 10, and thinking, oh, God. And you're so polite. When you're 9 and 10, you're so polite. And he said, oh, your parents be home soon. I said, yeah. Come in. So in he came, and he seemed harmless. I sort of knew him. I'd known him in the family situation. And we sat in the kitchen, and he'd just come back from India. He was a stone collector, so he'd come back, and he got little paper things for the rubies and semi-precious stones, and he's showing me these. He's sitting cross-legged on the chair, and I'm thinking, oh, God, please come home soon. And it was all fine, but the air was just starting to shift. Nothing happened, but the air did change. And I do remember that when my parents came back from the pub, they walked in and said nothing. But my mother blanched, absolutely blanched. And I thought, OK, I understand why I'm not supposed to let some people in. And I did ask her again in my revision for this evening. I said, is this memory right, that Rob came in? And she said, yeah. I said, his name was Rob, wasn't it? She said, yeah. She said, oh, yeah, Rob the Mad Axe Man. OK. So there we are. So all these worlds continue to collide. Us growing up and all the witchy stuff. So come the 70s. So fast forward from me being born in 67, we're now in 1977? Are we 77? Thereabouts, 76, 77. My father's recrowned King of the Witches. So, as you'd imagine, in any religion, quite frankly, being recrowned is quite a big event. And this is called the Sed rite. And Sed was a deity during Egyptian times who was a deity of renewal. He actually was a jackal-headed god, and when the pharaoh hit 30 years of his reign, they had a big party, big shindig. So this was my mother's going to kill me for the way I'm describing this. Sorry, then. So a massive event. This actually happened in London, but the preparation was happening in both temples. So it was happening in Bexhill and happening in Notting Hill. So as you can see here, we've got my father wearing the red crown of Egypt and holding a crook and flail. I do remember that his face was painted. It was actually using embalming fluid and gold flake, quite poisonous. But there we are. So, being kids, we got involved and we made the crowns, papier-mâché crowns. And we made a couple. So we made the red crown of Egypt and we made the white crown of Egypt. And the most famous version is when you have one on top of the other and you've got the white crown, you've got the red crown with the pointy bit at the back. So papier-mâché, glue, newspaper, sticky fingers and everything else. At the same time, we were doing ancient Egypt at school. And for a while it was my specialist subject because of all of this. So I knew my symbology, I knew my Horus, Isis, oh goodness, all the things, all the symbologies and so on. So when it came to a show and tell, we're doing ancient Egypt, what do you do? My specialist subject, I have to bring this in. I have made the white crown of Egypt. Oh, and I've made a crook and flail as well. So I took them in. Very much a crown, here's a crown I made earlier. It was received with a certain level of concern. But there we are. They knew who my father was. I'm reminded by a good friend that it was around the same year or so that some Christian evangelists in Bexhill took me to one side and made me renounce the devil. So, you know, a bit risky. Mother stoned by people in the streets, and me taken to one side, kneeling and told to renounce the devil. So, yeah, there you go. So you can learn quite quickly that context matters, basically, I think is what I'm saying. So eventually that whole life ended. When I was about 11, we came back to London, and I started secondary school. My father stayed here for another couple of years or so, and then he moved on to St Leonard's to follow a different path, which I didn't follow, mostly because I became a self-absorbed teenager. So I saw very little of him. You know, the distance grew literally geographically, but also being a self-absorbed teenager. So he would just come up to London a few times a year, probably. So yes, so that the post-Bexhill years, unfortunately, lost to me. But he died this day in 1988 from cancer. He was only 61. He's only 3 years older than I am now. Actually, a picture from the funeral. You don't get pictures of yourself taken at funerals, do you? It's quite funny. There you go. There I am, age 20. So today is Beltane. Some of you may know this, may not know this. So I've done some research again. Beltane apparently starts at sunset on the 30th of April and then goes through into May Day. So it's one of the great eight, I bet they don't call that in witchcraft circles either, the great eight, the 8 great Sabbaths of the year. There's the wheel of the year. And May Day, of course, and Beltane. Beltane is a fire festival, and May Day marks the peak of spring. So it's a very significant date in the pagan calendar, and I certainly know on the south coast that there's a lot of celebration and shenanigans happening this weekend. So obviously being King of the Witches, great timing. Great timing, Dad. So, yeah, just a couple of cuttings here. This one is quite funny, actually. Farewell Chuckle of King Witch. And it talks about him having put a curse on the Bexhill Light Operatic and Dramatic Society. There we go, still there. So I've got just a couple more anecdotes for you. So we had the funeral, Hastings Crematorium, and then actually the memorial was held here in early May. And then after his funeral, we went back. There was a gathering in Notting Hill, and this was really the witches from the 60s, 70s, 80s. 60s, 70s, 80s. And it was the only time that my brother and I were invited to step into a magic circle. And that was the purpose of that. It was a sending forth ritual, and we're invited as direct descendants to hold a cord between us, and that represents the measure of a person's height. So when you talk about getting the measure of a man, it literally is a measure that is used to measure a coffin. So we held the cord between us, and I believe we cut the cord, and it's very much a symbolic act to send him forth, release him, possibly ensuring he couldn't be called back, to be honest with you, because he was somewhat popular amongst his followers and probably also his detractors as well. So if you're going to be king of the witches, you don't want to be called back, to be honest with you. His ashes were scattered on the Long Man of Wilmington. So I've got one final footnote on this, which bothers even me, as you can see where I am in the Venn diagram of Sappy. Again, going back through some of my father's books, I wasn't really reading, I was just looking for the essence of the man. And I came across a line, and it was in King of the Witches. And again, he's talking about his practices and his beliefs. And he spoke about placing a red rose on his altar. And, nothing on my altar, only truth, I think it says something like that. And how when it's gone, the perfume still remains. And that's quite sort of powerful, whatever you believe. I thought that's quite sort of powerful symbology. And at the same time, I'm sitting on the big bed at home, the sunlight streaming in. My daughter was sitting next to me, I'm keeping her quiet. I was given a magnetic poetry kit for Christmas. Those ones with sort of 200 little tiny magnetic words. You can do a Shakespeare one, love poetry, whatever it is. My daughter's sitting playing with this magnetic poetry kit, and she turns to me and says, Mum, look what I've made. I hadn't been chatting to her at all. She didn't know what I was doing, quite frankly. And she created a small poem about the scent of a red rose, and it ends, 1,000 shadows play over me. Coincidence, of course. Again, Len, thank you. He also introduced the word synchronicity to me, which means meaningful coincidence. I'm still going with coincidence. However, the timing is very strange. Very strange. There we go. So, nearly there. How are we doing for time? I was struck when you were talking about your father and the fact that you could hear his voice. We don't all have the privilege, actually, of being able to hear our parents' voices 38, how many years after their death. So I took the opportunity, and there's all the made for stage, I think you called it, made for stage voice and theatrical films and so on. But I did come across some meditative, much more reflective meditations. And I really thought there'd be quite a lot of distance, but it was really immediate and familiar. And listening as an adult, I recognised something I hadn't understood as a child. He knew exactly how he came across. Flamboyant, provocative, impossible to ignore. So this returns me back to the questions I started at the beginning, which some people ask. Was he man, myth, or something closer to magic? Or was he performing all of this, so the performative side of things, as Sharon said, perhaps the day-to-day ritual isn't as cinematic as the way they presented it in some of these pictures. But was he performing all of this really carefully while keeping the real side of his beliefs slightly out of reach? He never resolved it. He never intended to do. In fact, he stayed on that line. Not only that, I think he actually really enjoyed dancing along that line, quite frankly. But finally, when I come back to think about him now, it's not that at all. It's something much smaller and more familiar. It's the kitchen at Chantry Cottage, the smell of his famous vegetable curry and the chapatis. The ginger beer popping in the kitchen. He used to make ginger beer, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. I don't know if you've ever made unsuccessful ginger beer. It pops everywhere. And people everywhere, sitting, talking, drifting in and out. And him at ease, always stirring something on the stove, just making sure that people felt welcome. And outside, the old town just carried on, shops closing, lights coming on, people going out of the beehive and pococs and the like, and no sense of really what was happening behind that front door. And really, I suppose what we're saying this evening, all these worlds, our worlds, existed in the same place. Because that's the thing about evenings like this, we're not just remembering history, we're holding on to people, events, memories, in whatever way we can. And when you leave tonight and you walk back through your old town, you won't just be seeing buildings, you'll be walking through the same spaces and places where we've talked about events this evening. From Julian's stories going way back, before pictures, before photographs, to Q and James Bond and the suffragettes, something a little less expected, perhaps. Lives lived in the same streets, and perhaps just briefly you'll feel a trace of that. A sense of something just beneath the surface, a quiet crossing between the worlds. Because these stories sit gently within our wider history, a reminder that national currents, culture, ideas, and even myth can pass quietly through places like this, leaving traces not always visible, but still felt. Thank you.